In 2006, a director sat in a room full of studio executives who had already told him no. He wanted to cast a specific actor as the lead in a film that was supposed to save a struggling comic book studio from bankruptcy. The executives pulled up a list. On that list was the actor's criminal record, 3 arrests, a prison sentence, and a reputation that made every insurance company in Hollywood refuse to cover him. No coverage meant no film could legally be made with him in it. The director looked at that list and said he wanted him anyway. That actor was Robert Downey Jr. That film was Iron Man. And the mindset that got him into that room is the same one that almost destroyed him 12 years earlier. This isn't a story about talent. Robert Downey Jr. was never short on talent. Everyone in Hollywood knew that from the moment he was a teenager. This is a story about what happens when raw talent runs completely unsupervised and what it actually takes to rebuild a mind capable of using that talent again. He grew up on film sets. His father was an underground filmmaker, and by the time Robert Downey Jr. was 5 years old, he had already appeared on camera in a movie where his own father gave him marijuana as part of a scene. That's not a rumor. It's something Downey has spoken about openly. Drugs weren't something he discovered later in life to cope with fame. They were present before he understood what fame even was, woven into his childhood as casually as any other prop on set. By the time he was a teenager, acting wasn't a dream he was chasing. It was simply the family business, and he was already good enough at it that adults twice his age were taking him seriously. He dropped out of high school to pursue it full-time, moved through small roles in the 80s, and started building a reputation as someone who could do things other young actors couldn't. Total commitment to a character, an instinct for comic timing paired with real dramatic weight, and a kind of restless intelligence on screen that made directors want to keep the camera on him even when he wasn't the one speaking. By his early 20s, he was one of the most respected young actors of his generation. In 1992, he was nominated for an Academy Award for playing Charlie Chaplin, a role that required him to essentially become another performer from the inside out. His commitment to that role is still studied by actors today. Critics called him one of the most naturally gifted actors alive. And underneath every one of those performances, the addiction that started in childhood kept growing right alongside the career. By the mid-1990s, the pattern was public. In 1996, he was arrested for possession of heroin, cocaine, and an unloaded gun after being found asleep in a neighbor's house, having wandered in through the wrong front door under the influence. It sounds almost absurd when you say it out loud. It wasn't absurd to live through. He was sentenced to probation and mandatory drug testing and failed those tests repeatedly over the following years, each failure documented, each one public, each one making the next role a little harder to get. In 1999, he violated his probation and was sentenced to state prison. Not a rehab facility with a nice name and a scenic view. An actual California state prison, where he served roughly a year before being released. Downey has described the strange clarity of that time. No cameras, no publicist managing the story, just a cell and a routine that nobody was asking his opinion on. While he was serving that time, the show he'd been working on, Ally McBeal, wrote him back in and then quietly wrote him out again after he failed more drug tests. He was one of the most talented actors of his generation, and Hollywood, an industry not exactly known for high moral standards, had run out of patience with him. In 2001, less than a year after his release, he was arrested again, found under the influence, alone at night, in Culver City, wandering the street barefoot. At that point, most people who knew him assumed the story was over, not slowing down. Over. Talented people flame out in this industry constantly, and there's rarely a second act after this many public collapses. Insurance companies, the quiet gatekeepers of the entire film industry, started treating his name as an automatic red flag on any production budget, which meant, practically speaking, that no studio could hire him even if they wanted to, regardless of how good the audition was. Here's the part of the story most people skip past too quickly, because it doesn't have a dramatic single moment attached to it. Robert Downey Jr. didn't get better because of one rock bottom scene, one speech, one turning point you could film in slow motion. He got better slowly, through years of unglamorous repetition, therapy, community support meetings, accountability structures he didn't design himself and had to submit to completely. He said many times since that the moment that mattered wasn't wanting to get sober. He had wanted that for years and failed every time. What mattered was finally being willing to do exactly what he was told by people he didn't necessarily trust yet, instead of trusting his own judgment about his own limits, because his own judgment was precisely the thing that kept failing. There's a detail in this story that rarely gets enough attention. His father, Robert Downey Sr., was also an addict for much of his own life and only got sober decades into his own career. Downey Jr. has talked about watching that pattern up close as a child, long before he understood it was a pattern at all, watching someone he admired struggle with the exact same thing he would later struggle with himself. It's easy to talk about addiction as a personal failing, a lack of willpower in one individual. It's harder and more honest to look at it as something closer to an inherited environment, a set of habits and coping mechanisms passed down before a child even has the vocabulary to resist them. That doesn't remove responsibility from the equation, but it changes what fixing it actually requires. You're not just fighting your own impulses, you're fighting a blueprint you didn't choose and didn't design. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. For most of his life, Downey's mindset had been built entirely around talent and instinct. Trusting himself in the moment, improvising, relying on being the smartest, quickest person in the room. That mindset made him a brilliant actor. It also nearly killed him, because addiction doesn't respond to talent or charm. It responds to structure, and structure was the one thing he had never fully surrendered to. Around 2003, while he was still considered close to unemployable by major studios, one person made a decision that changed the trajectory of his career. Mel Gibson personally paid the insurance bond required to get Downey cast in a film called The Singing Detective, putting his own money on the line as a guarantee because no studio would take that risk on their own. It wasn't charity, it was a bet from someone who believed the talent underneath the chaos was still there, and that the only thing missing was a structure solid enough to contain it. What makes that moment worth pausing on isn't the generosity of it. It's what Downey had to do to be worth betting on in the first place. Nobody hands a career-saving bond to someone who's still using, still missing calls, still unreliable on set. By the time that bond was offered, Downey had already put in years of the invisible, unglamorous part of recovery, the part that never makes it into a highlight reel, because there's nothing dramatic to film. Showing up to meetings, submitting to testing he didn't get to negotiate, building a track record one boring, uneventful day at a time, with no guarantee any of it would ever pay off in a role again. That bet started something. Small roles turned into steady work. Steady work turned into a reputation for actually showing up, actually being reliable, actually doing the unglamorous, boring, structural things that sobriety requires every single day, with no exceptions. By 2008, when Jon Favreau was casting Iron Man, Downey wasn't just talented again. He was talented and dependable, which is a completely different actor than the one who had walked into a stranger's house high in 1996. Marvel still couldn't get him insured through normal channels. So they built a workaround instead of walking away. Regular, mandatory drug testing, built directly into his contract, financial penalties if he failed, and Downey himself agreeing to put a portion of his own salary on the line as a guarantee, essentially insuring himself with his own future paycheck. Think about what that actually means. The man who once refused every form of external structure was now voluntarily building the strictest, most humiliating, most exposed version of accountability that Hollywood had ever put into a contract, and signing it willingly, because he finally understood that structure wasn't a cage. It was the only thing that had ever actually worked. Jon Favreau, the director who insisted on casting him in the first place, later said publicly that he saw something in Downey that had nothing to do with charity or sympathy. He needed someone who could genuinely play a character defined by arrogance and self-destruction on his way to becoming something better. And there was exactly one actor in Hollywood who had lived that arc for real, in front of cameras, in courtrooms, in a prison cell, instead of just performing it. The role of Tony Stark wasn't a redemption story handed to Downey out of pity. It was one of the only roles on Earth that actually required someone who had been through what he'd been through and come out the other side able to talk about it honestly. Iron Man came out in 2008 and became the film that launched an entire cinematic universe worth tens of billions of dollars. Robert Downey Jr. went from a man no studio would insure to, within a few years, one of the highest paid actors in the world. He carried that same role and that same discipline through more than a decade of films. Iron Man 2, The Avengers, Sherlock Holmes, Endgame, never once relapsing into the headlines that had defined his 20s. An entire generation of moviegoers grew up only knowing him as Tony Stark, with no idea that the actor underneath that suit had once been considered the biggest liability in the industry. But the mindset shift that made that possible didn't happen on set. It happened years earlier, in the exact moment he stopped trusting his own instincts more than the structure other people were offering him. That's the part of this story that actually applies to anyone watching, whether you've ever touched a drug in your life or not. Most people who fail repeatedly at something aren't failing from a lack of talent or a lack of desire. They're failing because they keep trusting their own in-the-moment judgment over the boring external structure that could actually protect them from themselves. The schedule, the accountability partner, the rule they don't get to negotiate with in the moment they most want to break it. Robert Downey Jr. Quote's mindset didn't change because he became more disciplined in the abstract. It changed because he finally accepted a structure he didn't get to control at the exact moment his own control had already proven it couldn't be trusted. He didn't out-talent his addiction. He out-structured it. And that shift didn't stay contained to sobriety alone. It became the operating system for the rest of his career. He became famously reliable on set, known for knowing his lines, showing up early, treating a Marvel shoot with the same seriousness he once refused to give his own health. He built a production company. He started investing in technology and sustainability ventures later in life, applying that same structured discipline to projects that had nothing to do with acting at all, as if he'd finally proven to himself that the method worked and simply kept applying it everywhere. Every version of the man who plays a genius billionaire in a metal suit was built on top of a man who once needed someone else's signature on a piece of paper just to be allowed to work. He never hid that. He's talked about it in interview after interview because he understands something most successful people are too proud to admit out loud. The comeback was never about becoming strong enough to control the chaos alone. It was about becoming humble enough to stop trying to. There's also something worth noticing in how he talks about this now, decades later, when he no longer has to explain himself to anyone. He doesn't frame the addiction years as a mistake he simply overcame through effort, the way a lot of celebrity comeback stories get flattened into a single inspirational sentence. He talks about it as an ongoing relationship with structure that never fully ends. Meetings he still attends, routines he still doesn't skip, a version of himself he still doesn't fully trust to run unsupervised, even after decades of proof that he can. That's not weakness. That's precisely the mindset that has kept him working, present, and reliable for over 20 straight years in an industry that chews up far more disciplined people than him. Compare that to how the story could have gone. There are dozens of actors from that same era, just as talented, who never made it back from a spiral that looked exactly like his. The difference wasn't raw ability. It was whether, at some point, they were willing to hand the wheel to a structure they didn't build and couldn't argue with in the moment it mattered most. If there's one thing worth taking from this that has nothing to do with fame or addiction, it's this. Talent gets you into the room once. It doesn't keep you there. What keeps you there is whether you're willing to let something outside of your own judgment hold you accountable, especially in the moments you're most convinced you don't need it. Robert Downey Jr. spent a decade proving what happens when you refuse that. He spent the next 2 decades proving what happens when you finally accept it.